All right, welcome everybody to Behind the Scenes Building the Interview Coach. I'm Teresa Torres, and we're going to get started here in just a minute. I'm going to give folks 30 seconds or so to get settled. While we're waiting for people to join, do me a favor. On the bottom of your Zoom window, you should see a chat window. Go ahead and open that up and let me know where you're joining us from. We tend to get a global audience, and it's fun to see where everybody's at. All right, Asheville, North Carolina, New York City. They're already coming in fast and furious. Pennsylvania, more New York, Texas, the UK, DC, Taiwan, excellent. San Antonio, Florida, New Jersey, India. All right, we've already got multiple continents represented. Norway, Mexico City, Iceland, Denmark, France, Chile, Romania. Wow, I think we're getting close to, I think we're at 5 continents, if I'm counting correctly. Croatia, Canada, Germany, Ireland, Argentina. Excellent. All right, keep them coming. It is really fun for me to see where everybody is located. Like I said, I'm going to give people another 10, 15 seconds to join, and then we are going to dive right in. So if you've been to one of my events before, today's webinar is going to be a little bit different. Typically, I do talks on continuous discovery. I'll do a little intro in just a second. This is more of a behind the scenes about how I built one of my AI tools. So we're going to get into building with AI. Okay, let's go ahead. Okay, we're 2 minutes after. We're going to go ahead and get started. So a couple common questions I'm going to tackle right away. This webinar is being recorded. You will receive a link to the recording 24 hours from now. So do me a favor, look at your clock, look at your watch, look at your phone. In 24 hours, you will get an email with a link to the recording. The recording will be available until the end of the day on Sunday. Okay, so today is Tuesday on the West Coast of the United States. The video will expire at the end of the day on Sunday. So once you get the recording, you're welcome to share it with friends and colleagues. You're welcome to even share it on social media. Just if you share it, please let people know the video will expire. All right, excellent. So today's topic is behind the scenes building the interview coach. For those of you that don't know me, I am Teresa Torres. I've spent the last 14 years working as a product discovery coach. I've worked with teams all over the world. This map is actually just the teams that I have personally coached. We also have course students from 102 countries around the world. And if you're not familiar with some of my offerings, I'm the author of the book Continuous Discovery Habits. And we also offer a number of product courses related to building good discovery habits. Today's webinar is going to be about a little bit different. It's going to be about a tool that I built to support one of our courses. And this story starts back in March. And I actually realized there's one last thing I should have told you about before we dove into our main comment. Okay, so a couple things. Usually when I do a webinar, I'm assisted by somebody who's helping with chat and Q&A. I added this webinar last minute, which means I am flying solo today. I'm going to do my best to keep an eye on the chat. We will do a Q&A portion at the end. If you would like me to answer your question during the Q&A portion, you're going to need to submit it during through the Q&A box. So if you look at your Zoom toolbar at the bottom, you have a chat window and a Q&A window. During the Q&A session, I will be taking questions during the Q&A window. All right, I see that Christina is here. I'm glad you were able to make it. All right, excellent. So normally as part of my day job, I'm building out online courses. I focus on training teams on how to do discovery well. In March, I had an accident where I broke my ankle and had to have ankle surgery. That meant that I spent 3 months at home with nothing to do. I had a lot of free time. And so I decided to use that time to answer this question of, what does generative AI make just now possible? So this story is literally about the last 3 months. Everything you're going to hear in this story started in late March I think I started this project around March 23rd after I came out of my drug-induced haze of recovering from surgery. And you're going to see how quickly I was able to make progress. The other thing I want to note is I will highlight the first time I wrote code. So one of the themes in this talk is going to be about who does what. Should it be product managers? Should it be engineers? I got pretty darn far without having to write a single line of code. So we're going to get into that as well. So this was my driving question. I literally sat on the couch with my foot up on my laptop, trying to figure out how I could use generative AI in the context of teaching. This is the really important part. I'm on LinkedIn like all of you. I'm seeing someone saying they can't find our course, but they're including a link. If you want to, that is the link. So I'm a little bit confused, Lewis, if you want to just clarify if you're having problems with that link. I see a lot on LinkedIn about people using AI to like automate some of their discoveries. So we're interviewing synthetic users or using AI to synthesize our interviews. I'm going to tell you I've run these experiments. This technology is too new to say those things will never work. But what I'm going to tell you is my interest is in using generative AI to help humans build skills to connect with humans. So I'm not that interested in how do we automate all of this away. I think as long as we're building for humans, we need to be talking with humans, building empathy for other humans, and engaging with humans. So a lot of my focus was how can I use these tools to facilitate teaching and skill building? And this particular project was focused on our continuous interviewing course. If you are interested in this course, our next cohort starts in July. You can find this at learn.producttalk.org/continuous interviewing. Somebody has already put a link to it in chat. There's a couple things I want to highlight about this course just for context for the tool. I promise this webinar is not a sales pitch. A little bit of context is helpful for understanding the tool that I built. So in continuous interviewing, this course is all about effective customer interviews. There's a couple things that we focus on. We focus on how to ask the right questions. A big part of this is I teach a style of formatting called story-based interviewing, where we focus on collecting past customer stories, so stories about what our customers did in the past. We also practice active listening techniques. So this is a lot about how do we ask the right questions and how do we be present. Across all of our courses, a big part of our teaching philosophy is practice-oriented. So we do a lot of hands-on practice. And in this interviewing course in particular, students go through the material and then they come to class and they practice interviewing each other. And as part of that practice, a lot of my course design is influenced by Anders Ericsson's work and this idea of deliberate practice. Well, in the idea of deliberate practice, we need feedback on our practice. So we do a lot to teach students how to give each other feedback on their practice. And so when I started to ask this question of what does generative AI make just now possible, I was wondering, can we help students give each other better feedback on their practice interviews? And for those of you that are familiar with educational research or are teaching nerds, I know Christina is here, a big idea in teaching is to model what you want students to do. And so it led to this question of, can we model what good feedback looks like? And this led to me experimenting what has now become the interview coach. Okay, so this is the context, the problem I'm trying to solve. I have a bunch of students practicing their interviewing skills. I want to give them better feedback. I want to help them give each other feedback. How do I model what good feedback looks like? And so I literally sat down and I started to play with how do I teach an LLM to give students feedback on their practice interviews. Now in our courses, we already have a rubric. We're already teaching our students how to give each other feedback. And so the rubric we give them looks like this. This is one of the rubrics we give them. So in week 1, when they're practicing, they're focusing on collecting a good customer story. And we break this down into 4 key skills. The first skill is how do I open with a story-based question? So I'm asking something like, tell me about the last time you watched Netflix, and not something like, what do you like to watch? We teach them to set the scene. So to get context for the story, this helps the participant remember their story. It also helps the interviewer better understand their story because they understand the context in which it occurs. We teach them how to build a timeline. So how do you collect the full timeline of what happened? And then most humans are really bad about staying in the specifics of a story. We tend to generalize. So I might say something like, we watched an action movie, but I actually really don't like action movies. So that's not what I typically watch. I just went from a specific to a generalization. So the fourth skill we teach in week 1 is how do you redirect generalizations back to the specific story. Okay, so we already had this as part of our course. This is something we give students when they're listening to each other's interviews. They're listening for how did they do on each of these skills. So my very first interview coach MVP, I literally started in ChatGPT. I set up a custom GPT. So for those of you that are brand new to some of these tools, a custom GPT just lets you set some custom instructions. You can upload some files. And I started very simple. All that was required for this first MVP was a $20 subscription to ChatGPT and a $20 subscription to Claude. I tried out both. I wrote a really simple prompt. In fact, if you want to steal this, you can, because it relies entirely on public information. I just told the LLM, you're an expert in Teresa Torres's method of story-based customer interviews. I gave it a couple of articles it could read. These are public blog posts. And then I uploaded a version of this story-based rubric where I basically told it a little bit about each of these 4 dimensions. And I was just trying to understand how good would it be? Okay. This was literally my MVP. And I think I did this on day 1. So on the very first day with playing with some of these ideas, I just was wondering how good is this going to be? And it was pretty surprising. So I actually ran one of my own interview transcripts. My interview wasn't a story-based interview, and I was actually really curious to see if it would catch that. And you can see here that it did. It's telling me I actually didn't do a good job of asking a story-based question. It's telling me I didn't really set the scene. When we get down here, it does tell me I built a timeline, but I'm already in my 1 hour prototype already starting to get some pretty interesting feedback of okay, it actually does, it can understand this idea of a story-based interview. It can understand these dimensions of my rubric. And I'll share, I'm seeing some people saying they need to log into that link, which is very bizarre. If you're having problems, just go to learn.producttalk.org and you should not need to log in. For those of you that are having problems, give me a little more description of what you're seeing and I'll try to help out. Okay, so this was a pretty crude prototype, but already I'm like, wow, this is better than I thought it would be. And so this got me thinking, it turns out all the work that I've done to teach humans these skills, developing rubrics, developing lesson plans, teaching clarity of ideas, teaching know-how, is a lot of the same skills we need when teaching an LLM how to do the same thing. And I was like, okay, yeah, so Ellen Jolin is the instructor for our July cohort. That is, Ellen Jolin teaches our interviewing course. I'll talk a little bit about that in just a few minutes. Okay, so it turns out all the work that we do to teach humans is very applicable to teaching an LLM. And so I thought okay, if I can get this far in an hour or 2, if I put some time into this, how good can I make this? But I had a concern. I was like, okay, but how do I make this real? I'm working in the context of a custom GPT and a Claude project. These are on my own private account. How do I make this real? And one thing I'll highlight, I did notice that both OpenAI and Claude were able to do this fairly well. I didn't see a huge difference. You're going to see in a little bit, there was a moment where I did see a huge difference, and I'll share what that was and what I chose to use. But at this point, they are both fairly equivalent. My 1 or 2 hour prototype impressed me. And I started to ask more pragmatic questions of like, how might I deploy this? Like, let's say this works. How do I deploy it? Like, how do I get it in the hands of my students? And I ran into a couple roadblocks right away. So the first one is there's no API access to Claude projects. So I can't share a Claude project with my students. Now, I can share a custom GPT with my students, but the problem is custom GPTs, they're a little bit hard to lock down. They're like either public to everybody, which I don't want. I want this just to be a tool for my students, or they have to be on my team. I certainly don't want to pay $20 a month for everybody in my class just to have access to my tool. And so I very quickly ran into this, like the way that I was prototyping wasn't going to turn into a production quality product. And so I had to, I really got stuck. Even like an hour or two in, I was like, okay, this is a fun toy, but how do I make this a real product? The other thing I ran into is that I really need to embed this in my learning management system. This was designed to be a course tool. I needed to be able to like embed it in a access controlled tool. I wanted to rate limit it because I was really afraid of how much this was going to cost me. Like, were people going to use this 1,000 times and I'm just paying for all the API calls out of pocket? And I really wanted to be able to spin up more tools like this. So even after like an hour or two of prototyping, I was like, wow, I can see the value of this in teaching. If I look across all my courses, I could build a lot of feedback tools. I started to get ideas for simulation tools where you could interview the LLM to practice building your skill. And I was like, okay, I'm sold. There's a lot that's just now possible. But I got a little bit stuck with how do I deploy this? How do I make it real? How do I meet some of these requirements? And that's when I learned about Replit. And so I went to Replit and I thought, can I build a tool in Replit that allows me to deploy teaching tools effortlessly? And so I thought about like, really what I want is I want Claude projects because I was having a lot of success with Claude projects, but in a way that I could embed the chat interface into my LMS. And so what I did was I went to Replit, I used the agent, and I just told it what I wanted. And I got pretty darn far. I was able to spin up this tool that's just a chat interface builder. I was able to build different chat interfaces. And let me just show you how this works. It's really simple. I basically was able to name my chat interface. I could decide who had access to it. I could define a prompt that this chat interface, like a system prompt that the chat interface used. I could upload files that became part of the prompt. I could provide instructions to my students. And I could also choose a model, set the temperature. I also added rate limiting. And then what this did was it allowed me to embed a chat interface. And this was just through an embed code right in my LMS. And I could even rate limit based on my student's ID. So I could embed this in the LMS. My LMS could pass the student ID to this tool, and I could do rate limiting. I could have custom prompts. I could add all my proprietary course content to it, and students didn't, and that was all safe. And let me tell you, I had never used Replit before. I built this tool in 2 days. It blew my mind. I was like, okay, wow, the future really is here. This is spectacular. And I suddenly was like, I'm going to have 1 million of these tools. I'm going to build the interview coach and the interview snapshot coach and the opportunity solution tree coach. And I was just like, this is amazing. I now have a tool that allows me to deploy teaching tools. And so what I did was I had to think about, who am I going to deploy this to? Who's my first test population? And what I decided to do, because I'm focused on teaching, I decided to deploy it to my alums of my interviewing course. I didn't want to deploy it to my students first because I didn't know how good it was. And I don't want to interfere with people who are currently building the skill. I wanted to deploy it to people who've already built this skill and see how they do with it. And so I deployed it to my alumni. And I also did this very hands-on, where they gave me their transcript. I uploaded it to the tool because I wanted to be able to see the quality of the coaching feedback. I was really concerned about, is this going to be good enough? And let me walk you through a real example. So an alum gave me, sorry, I'm also trying to keep up with chat. An alum gave me their transcript, gave me permission to run it. And this was one of my very first tests with real content that wasn't my own interviews. And you can see here, it's grown a little bit. So I score the transcript on 4 dimensions. These come from my teaching rubric. And then the LLM says, what did you do well? And it gives some feedback about what did it do well. And you can see here, the student did a fairly good job. This was one of our alums. They were already learning how to do story-based interviewing. And you can see here, it tells them they did a great job asking a story-based question. They did a good job collecting the timeline. They did a good job clarifying details. Okay, this is all great, but our students don't just need to be told what they did well. We also want to give them room for improvement. So you can see here, it gives some areas to practice. There were some missed opportunities for setting the scene. They could have been more consistent with redirecting generalizations. They missed some opportunities to explore some emotions. Okay, and then the LLM also gives an overall tip. And it's basically saying, overall, this was a really good story-based interview, but there's some opportunities for improvement. So I sent this to the student and I said, give me your feedback. Was this helpful? And the student responded completely unprompted. He said, wow, this is shockingly good. Okay, so now I'm like, okay, it's not just me who's amazed by how good this is. Like, I've now run it through a number of our alums' transcripts. I did this for about a dozen alums with real transcripts, just trying to understand, is this helpful? How do people respond to the feedback? And I was like, okay, there's something real here. What do I do next? And so I decided to release it to my April cohort. I'm like 2 weeks into this project, by the way. I started at the end of May. We're now early April. I have a cohort of continuous interviewing starting in April. And I basically offered to all of my April students, if you want to get feedback on your live class practice interviews, here's how it's going to work. You're going to record your session. You're going to send me the video. We're going to run your transcripts through the interview coach, and we're going to see how it did. Now, for anybody who's ever released a product ever with real customers, you uncover some new issues. And of course, I uncovered many new issues. The first one is students were hitting their rate limit artificially. So by design, I set the rate limit as 2 practice interviews a week. That's because they do a practice interview in class. I wanted them to be able to run their transcript through the interview coach. And then if they tried it in their own work, I wanted them to be able to run a second interview. Well, students were actually hitting their rate limit by running their transcript and then asking the LLM for feedback. Like, it would basically say, like, you missed an opportunity to build the timeline here. And the student would type in, can you give me the excerpt of where I missed that opportunity? So what was great is students were engaging with the tool like it was a real coach, right? The feedback was helpful enough, the student wanted to know more. But the problem is my rate limits were based on messages to the LLM, and they very quickly ran out of messages. The other thing I noticed is that, like, students really wanted excerpts from their interview, from the transcript. Like, show me what I did. Show me what I did well. Show me what I can improve. Don't just tell me. So this was a huge, being able to see real traces of student input, LLM response, student input was really eye-opening on how people wanted to use this. The second thing that I ran into, which was a little bit problematic, was I noticed that students were uploading their real customer interviews. And I was not prepared for this. I built this tool to give feedback on their practice interviews in class. And once I realized I was getting real student data, I freaked out, or real customer data, I freaked out a little bit. Because I don't have SOC 2 compliance, I was storing these transcripts in an Airtable. I was a little bit worried about, like, am I set up to store real customer interview transcripts? And you're going to see this is a theme that's going to be pervasive throughout this project. So I started to get a little bit worried about, ooh, what did I do here? Did I open Pandora's box from a data standpoint? The next thing I uncovered was the interview coach was actually starting to confuse some of my rubric criteria. And some of the responses to students I was seeing, it was using the guidelines on, like, building a timeline when giving feedback on setting the scene. And part of this was because my prompt was getting really, really long, like pages and pages long. And that's because I was using one prompt for the whole interview coach. And so I had to know the context for all 4 dimensions. As I uncovered errors, I was updating the prompt, and it was just getting really unwieldy. And this is when I started to look into like, how do people deal with long prompts? And here's what I ended up learning. A lot of people are using what's called an AI workflow, where they're dividing their big long prompts into smaller tasks and they're stringing together multiple LLM calls. So I wanted to do that. I wanted to split each dimension into its own AI call. So I went back to my Replit tool and I tried to modify this tool so that each chat interface could actually be a series of prompts instead of one prompt. Well, I spent a full week going back and forth on this tool, and I will tell you, I failed. I could not get Replit to reliably extend my tool. Now, part of this is because it got really confused about its own development context. I've seen a lot of people on LinkedIn share similar experiences. Like you can get your first version of the product out, but then as soon as you try to iterate, it got confused about whether we were using Drizzle or Prisma. Those are like database schema technologies. It got confused about like what React components it was using. And I pretty much lost a week of my life, like arguing with the Replit agent. At this point, I got frustrated. I posted on LinkedIn. I asked for some tips. I got amazing tips about using the assistant versus the agent. It helped a little bit. But at this point, I realized that I didn't actually need a chat interface. And the chat interface was causing a lot of the problems, right? If you remember, one of the first pieces of student feedback I uncovered was that by it being a chat interface, students wanted to chat with the LLM about their feedback, but I didn't build it for that purpose. Like this wasn't intended to be a multi-turn conversation. It was intended to be upload your transcript, get the same type of feedback you might get from an instructor. And so at this point, I abandoned Replit. I decided I outgrew this prototype. It was time for a different solution. And this is when I moved to a combination of my LLM, like the tools that my LMS provides, plus Zapier. So I moved to a structure where now I'm using just like a homework assignment in my LMS where they can cut and paste their transcript and submit it, and that triggers a zap. And I'm going to explain how all this works in pretty clear detail here. So the first thing I had to do was I had to tell my students, like before you upload a transcript, remove any sensitive data. I was a lot more upfront about the fact that like I am not set up to reliably store real interview transcripts. I also added a consent question about by uploading a transcript, you're giving me permission to store it. This is really critical if you're building LLM apps. You're going to see later, you're going to need to get a good LLM app. You need lots of traces. So a trace is the user's input and the LLM's response. And you're going to see later when we get into the quality of like, how do I know if this tool is good or not? Having that data was critical. And so in the second iteration, I boosted sort of my data practices. I let people know even before they see this screen. I explain that I'm not SOC 2 compliant. I explain that they need to remove any sensitive information from their transcript. I give them tips on how to do that. And then they have to give me permission to store the trace for 90 days. Once they submit this assignment, it triggers a zap. You can see this is triggered by a LearnWorlds assessment. This LearnWorlds is my course platform. The next thing that I'm doing is I'm filtering. This is checking this consent question. If they don't consent, the zap just ends. They don't get feedback. If they do consent, I store the transcript. I'm actually just using Airtable. You'll see throughout this talk, I'll be transparent about all the tools that I'm using. Part of the reason why I'm doing that is I see a lot of people get distracted by all these off-the-shelf tools. I built all of this using tools I already owned. So I'll explain that as I go. So I store the transcript in Airtable, and then you'll see these next 4 calls are just LLM calls. I'm using the Anthropic API. Each one of these sub-zaps is storing my prompt for each of the 4 dimensions. They all get returned to this zap. so that I can then format the response. So each of these individual calls returns some JSON. That's maybe if you don't code at all, JSON feels like code. It's just an output format that's easy to work with programmatically. It's very human readable as well. I then format the responses across the 4 independent calls, and I store the response in Airtable. This is really important because I'm trying to get those traces, user input plus LLM response. And then I email the student the response. And here's the really key part. I also email myself the response. And I did this for a long time. I still do this because I'm really concerned about quality. I'm really concerned about, am I giving my students something that is telling them the wrong thing? And I will also be upfront, there has been a couple of times where I saw the response and I saw some errors in the coach, and I followed up with the student. And I said, hey, this was really good feedback. I actually see a concern with this one piece. Let me just correct it for you. And so that was my earliest way of monitoring quality, even though now there's no human in the loop. Students upload their transcripts on their own. The Zap runs the LLM calls and then emails the students. Okay, so then this allowed me, now you can see this is actually the real email I send to people. This is an email that I sent myself. I explained to my students, this is AI generated feedback. We're not making it look like this is coming from an instructor. We're very honest about this is coming from our interview coach. And you can see here, we've changed the format a little bit. So I've switched because we saw that students wanted excerpts. Now each dimension, the LLM is pulling out excerpts from the transcript and then giving a tip on that excerpt. It's telling them, did they do a good job? Did they miss the opportunity? And at this point, every dimension is its own LLM prompt. And by doing that, I saw a dramatic improvement. I can now do excerpts. The coach is giving feedback on each excerpt. We're not just telling students what they did, we're showing them what they did. And you can see here, this is not, this interviewer is asking, could you walk us through your recent substation project you've been working on? And if you talk more about the type of structure, the work you've been doing. Okay, the tip here is that they asked a general question. So they didn't say, tell me about your last substation project. They said, tell me about your projects in general. The question went on for a little too long. They asked for too much. This is actually a pretty darn good tip. If I come over here under setting the scene, same thing. We've got a quote, could you walk me through? That's from the transcript. And you can see the coach is saying this is a missed opportunity. They just started to tell their story. They should have asked a setting the scene question. Another great tip. So at first glance, this looked amazing. I was like, wow, splitting the prompts, amazing. But then I noticed something. Over here, this first excerpt is the same as this first excerpt. And over here, we're saying this is a general question. You should have asked a story-based question. And over here, it's saying this is a good story-based question. What's happening? Okay, one of the consequences of splitting my prompts into 4 different prompts, now my setting the scene coach doesn't know what a good story-based question is anymore. And it thinks this is a good story-based question. And now I'm getting inconsistent feedback across my dimensions. So on the one hand, splitting my prompts dramatically improved how the LLM did on each dimension, but it meant that sometimes it gave feedback on things that it shouldn't have because another dimension was covering it. So this introduced a whole new set of problems. And I started to get a little bit frustrated at this point. I'll be honest. Like I'm like, oh, I feel like I'm taking 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Maybe if I'm optimistic, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And it started to raise some serious questions for me. And I started to ask, how do I know if my interview coach is any good? And this is really important to me because for any of you who have taught before, if students already get confused when you give them like top-notch, really good teaching materials. If you give them something that's slightly off, it can completely derail them, right? So for me, quality was the most important thing. And I was like, at this point, I was just iterating by prompting and looking at traces, prompting, looking at traces. And I started to really wonder is, how do I know if my model changes, my prompt changes, my temperature changes? How do I know if they're having any impact, right? How do I know if I am making this better? Like, I'm just looking at individual traces. This seemed crazy. And so I started to dig in and I started to research, like, what are people doing to evaluate their LLM-based prompts? And it turns out the answer is evals. Some of you have probably heard about evals. I'm seeing somebody in chat brought it up. Here's the problem. Everybody defines evals this differently. It's not the same way. So I'm going to talk through 3 different definitions of evals and why they all frustrated me. So we're going to start with the first one. This comes from OpenAI, the company that built ChatGPT. They define an eval as you describe the task to be done. You run your eval with test inputs. You analyze the results. You change your prompt. Okay, this sounds a lot like what I've been doing. I described the task I wanted it to do. I ran the results. I looked at my trace. I changed my prompt. Really, this is all evals are? Like, I don't feel confident that what I'm doing is working. Like, every change, I see some problems fixed. I see other problems created. Like, how do I know that I'm making a good product, right? And so I was pretty frustrated by OpenAI's definition. So then I came across this Python tool, Pydantic evals, and I started to look at their definition. And in this definition, they start to talk about it as cases and data sets. And so it's a little bit more sophisticated. It's this idea of, like, you create a data set of examples of, like, here's a bunch of transcripts, here's a bunch of LLM responses, here's the desired output, and then you run your evals, which literally just means send those inputs to the LLM, see what the output is, and see if it's what your expected output was. And I was like, okay, this is a little better, but, like, how do I construct this data set? How do I know that it represents what I'm doing in production? How do I know that, like, it's covering all the possible things that could go wrong? Like, I was still a little bit uncomfortable with, like, really? This is what evals are? This is how we define what good looks like? And then Lenny came out with his deep dive on evals, and we're getting to another definition of evals. And in this article, they talk about multiple types of evals. And so they talk about human in the loop evals. I'm like, okay, that's what I've been doing. I'm looking at lots of traces. I'm looking at the output. I'm changing my prompt. I'm kind of getting there, but it doesn't feel scalable. I'm not really confident. My interview coach is good. And then I'm looking at, code-based evals and LLM-based evals. Interesting. What are those? And I started to dig deeper. And thankfully, I came across, very fortuitously, the day before enrollment closed, an AI for evals course that actually really resonated with me, and I learned a lot. And here's what I was really focused on. How do I have confidence in my evals? If I'm creating a data set that's my test set of, is my LLM app good? How do I know that data set represents what my students are really going to experience? And in this course that I took, it's called AI Evals for Engineers and PMs. It's taught by Hamil Hussain and Shreya Shankar. It's on Maven. They introduced this process. You start by analyzing your traces and doing error analysis. You identify your most common error categories. You build evals for those error categories. So we're talking about code-based evals and LLM-based evals. We're not talking about just running data sets and comparing outputs. And then you improve your prompt. And when you run your evals, you can see, did it get better? Okay, here's why this really resonated with me. I'm a discovery coach. What is discovery about? It's about fast feedback loops. Suddenly, this was a way to build in a fast feedback loop on my LLM app. And so what I did was I implemented this process. I had a whole bunch of traces, right? Because my students had opted in to let me store their transcripts with their LLM responses. I went through and did error analysis. This is the step that most people skip. What does this mean? I annotated all of my traces. So I went through and I looked at the LLM response. I did this for each of my dimensions, not each transcript. I'm measuring on we've talked through 4 dimensions. I'm actually measuring on 7 dimensions. And I started annotating, what did the LLM get wrong? And boy, was this scary because I uncovered a lot of errors. I uncovered things like the LLM was suggesting leading questions. The LLM was suggesting general questions. These are things we teach you should not do. I absolutely do not want a coach who is giving my students incorrect feedback. Okay, I'm going to pause for a minute and highlight something. At this point, I have not written a line of code. I have a product that's being used by real students. I was able to deploy it. I'm able to evaluate how well it's doing. I've been able to do my error analysis. By the way, if you want to know what tool this is Airtable. I'm storing my traces in Airtable. This annotation tool that you're looking at is an Airtable interface. People get super caught up on what eval tool they should use. I was able to do all of this in Airtable. Now, if you want to know how I wrote and ran my evals, don't worry, we're getting there. Okay, so this scared me because I was like, oh my gosh, this is not good enough. Okay, so the eye test, just vibe checking my LLM responses, my interview coach looked great. I was getting great feedback from students. But as soon as I'm actually doing error analysis, I'm a little bit terrified. I'm like, wow, I cannot put this in front of students. So I got serious about evals. Now I'm going to tell you a story about tooling. I have written code before. I started my career as a web developer. I know JavaScript pretty darn well. I've been writing in Node.js for the last 3 years, implementing a lot of the business logic in my business. I had never used a Jupyter notebook, and I had never written a line of Python. This is a true story. On a Sunday, about 3 weeks ago, I sat down and started to define my first code-based and LLM-based evals. I had never used a Jupyter notebook. I had never written Python. I'm going to tell you, I did all of this in 3 days in a Jupyter notebook in Python. Why did I use those tools? This whole error analysis process, this LLM-based, code-based eval process is coming from the data science world. Machine learning, right? That's where a lot of these techniques are coming from. They all use Python. They all use Jupyter notebooks. I didn't want to deal with the off-the-shelf eval tool. I wanted to learn this process myself. I wanted to make sure I knew it inside and out before I was influenced by a tool's point of view on evals. So here's what I did. I wrote my own evals. This is from a Jupyter notebook. One of my most common error categories was the LLM was suggesting a leading question. So I wrote an LLM as judge eval. Here's how this works. An LLM as a judge, you basically give it, in this case, all I needed to give it was the LLM response. This is my prompt. You can see it right here on the screen. This is going to 4.0 mini. You can see this code block is calling a Lambda function. So all my production code runs in AWS. But right now, when I'm doing this, at this stage, I'm on my Mac 4 Mini, my M4 Mac Mini. I'm running in a local Python environment. Remember, I had never written Python. I'm working in a Jupyter notebook. How did I learn how to do this? I asked ChatGPT, how do I get started with Jupyter notebooks? It walked me literally through everything I was doing. I set up my first Jupyter notebook. I started writing my first evals. This is a real eval. This is the full definition of one of my evals. It's just an LLM prompt. It's sending the LLM response plus the prompt to 4.0 mini, and it's asking, are there any leading questions in this response? Pass, fail. If there's a leading question, it fails. If there's not a leading question, it passes. Another one of my other examples was the LLM was suggesting a general question. What do you typically do? What do you usually do? What do you generally do? You can see this is a really simple code-based prompt. This code-based prompt is just looking for specific red flag words in the questions. Okay, this is 2 examples of my real evals. How did I get here without knowing Python? I can read code, and Python, it turns out, is a very human-readable language. I basically just talked to ChatGPT. I said, I'm working in a Jupyter notebook. Here's my error category. Here's how I think I would solve this. Like, I think I need an LLM judge. I think I can solve it in code. And I said, help me write the Python. It wrote the Python because it's human readable. I looked at it and said, that looks like it makes sense. If there was something I didn't understand, I said, explain to me what that line means. I cut and pasted it into my Jupyter notebook. I ran it. I tested the data. If it worked, great. Okay. I'm going to get to how I deployed in just a second, so hang tight. Okay. So these are 2 evals. I'll tell you, this is just for 1 dimension. I have 7 dimensions to the interview coach. This is 1 dimension. I actually have about a dozen evals for this 1 dimension. A lot of them are code evals. Some of them are LLM as judge evals. Let me tell you the value of this. I can now take a set of traces, so interviews plus LLM responses, run them across all my evals. By the way, I do this right in my Jupyter notebook, and this is what it spits out. These columns are my common failure modes, and it's telling me for each transcript, did it pass or did it fail? Now here's what's interesting here, right? Okay, so what's going on here with too much STS? Turns out this uncovered a problem in my human grading rubric. In this particular example, the LLM as judge was actually, or the code eval was actually better at evaluating this than my human graders. And it told me I needed to update my rubric for my human graders. So it looks like this, it looks like there were a lot of errors, but in practice, most of these reds turned green. If I look here, the story queue eval, it's actually passing almost all the time. That's a really strong eval. Now, one of the things that's a problem when you get into evals that you're going to realize pretty quickly, this eval over here on the left is a judge, an LLM is judge. How do I know this LLM is doing the right thing? So one of the things I learned in my class is we can score our judges. So for each of these judges, I can compare their output to human grader output, understand their true positives, their false negatives, and understand my error rate on my judges. Okay, we just got really technical. This is also the first time I wrote code. So some of you that are not engineers, if I lost you, please do not panic. Like I said, I never used a Jupyter notebook. I never wrote Python before. I did this in 3 days. This is 3 days of work. What you're looking at here, this is my first run. This grid right here is my first run of how many times I saw errors across these error categories. And this table just tells me, do my code and LLM evals match my human evals? That's all I'm doing here. Do my human graders match my code graders? Can I trust them? That's really what's going on. Okay, so what does this do for me? It helps me answer, how do I know my interview coach is any good? How do I know that when I make changes, if they're having any impact? And what I get from this little table is now I can run experiments. Every time I make a model change, every time I make a prompt change, every time I make a temperature change or a chunking strategy change or any other change, I now have a fast feedback loop. I make the change, I run my evals, I decide to release it or toss it. How am I making that decision? Does this grid get more green? And if it doesn't get more green, where's my problem? What error category is failing more often? And because I'm not just relying on a fixed data set, I can run these evals forever. I can run them on I have low volume traces because I'm just using this in a course. I can run this on every single trace I collect and always have an understanding of what evals, how my coach is performing. Okay, this was actually my very first eval run. I have made a million changes since then. I have run probably hundreds of experiments. A lot of these reds are turning to green. I can have a lot of confidence because I now have a fast feedback loop. Am I building the right thing? Okay, I'm seeing a question about human graders. I'm going to show you what I did for human grading. I will tell you, so far, I have been my only human grader. I am the human grader. But I am going to move to a point where, sorry, I'm moving slides. I'm just trying to find the right slide. I am going to move to a point where my instructors become my human graders as well. And I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, sorry, I went back way too far because I can't talk and navigate slides at the same time. When I started talking about my evals, let's get there. We're going to get there. This is Airtable. I literally created an Airtable interface. All my traces are on the left. I annotated in this box right here. I literally typed in what's wrong with this response, and then I marked it reviewed. And then after I created everything, I came up with my most common failure categories, and that's what I built evals around. So that literally my human grading process was I looked at traces in Airtable, I annotated them, I used those to generate failure categories. Okay, I'm going to talk about what's next, like what's coming next, and then we'll get to questions. And I know we only have 10 minutes left. I'll stay a little bit longer to answer questions for folks who are interested. Okay, so what's next? There's a lot left on the interview coach. I am still iterating. I am still uncovering new failure categories. I'm still writing evals. I'm still making improvements based on what I'm learning. One of the things that I uncovered was this data problem. I am not set up to store real customer interviews. So I'm actually partnering with Vistily. If you're not familiar with Vistily, they are a product discovery tool. They give you a tool for building your opportunity solution trees. They allow you to upload transcripts. They help you identify opportunities from transcripts. They are SOC 2 compliant. They are set up to store real customer data quickly. And I am going to be partnering with them where our course students will be able to run the interview coach on their real customer transcripts. We are hoping to launch a beta group in late July and a much bigger launch in September. So, especially for those of you who are listening, if you're a Vistily customer and you're able to join our July cohort of continuous interviewing, you will get access to the interview coach on your real interview transcripts. So everybody in our course gets access to the interview coach on their practice transcripts. Through Vistily, we're able to give feedback on real interview transcripts. Now, as part of this, I had to get away from prototyping and get closer to a real production environment. So I moved out of Zaps. I'm now working out of AWS Lambda and Step functions. I'm doing that for a couple of reasons. It's a much more reliable production environment. It's still I can run a mix of Node.js, which is what most of my code base is in, and Python. So I run all my evals in Python. I run most of my code in Node.js. A step function lets me orchestrate both. So when a student uploads a transcript either to Vistily or through the course interface, my interview coach code runs. We send the email to the student. My evals run immediately afterwards. Okay, so that's my production environment. What else is next? This is the first of many LLM tools I've been experimenting with. I'm also working on an interview snapshot coach. I'm also working on creating interactive interview simulations where you can practice your interviewing skills and get scored on how you did through a simulation. So from my standpoint, I'm very excited about the potential of these tools for teaching and skill building. We're going to be rolling out these tools across all of our courses. If you are interested in the interview coach and you want feedback on your interview transcripts, our next cohort of continuous interviewing starts on July 9th. Ellen Jolin is the instructor for that class, but I will tell you, I will be very hands-on with the interview coach in that class. You'll also be hearing from me if you use that interview coach. One thing this did for me is it really opened my eyes to how the world is changing with LLM apps and evals. And it started to raise a lot of questions. Why aren't more teams doing evals this way? Why are we just relying on data sets? Why aren't we doing proper error analysis? Why aren't we doing code-based and LLM-based judges? It also really raised the question of who does what. I did have to write some code to implement this, but I do think product managers need to be involved in evals from beginning to end because they might have the most domain expertise. I'm also really curious about what role does the customer play in evals, and I'll be running a lot of experiments on how to get customer feedback on traces and how to have customers help with error analysis. And then I'm curious from you, what do you want to know more about? Because I'm definitely going to be doing more in this space. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of questions pop up in chat. Do me a favor. I'm going to stick around and answer as many questions as I can. If you only put your questions in chat, please pop them in the Q&A window. It's a little bit easier for me to see what I've answered and not answered. And like I said, I'm going to hang out for a few minutes extra if you're able to hang out. Otherwise, the whole Q&A will also be on the recording. Okay, what are the final tools used and what was built with code? Okay, so to get started, I used Claude projects, OpenAI custom GPTs. I then moved to a Replit app that I very quickly outgrew. I then moved to an assessment tool, like a homework tool in my LMS that triggered a zap. And then eventually I moved to AWS step function, which by the way is still triggered by a zap because the trigger action is, well, in my course, the trigger action is submitting the assessment. That triggers a zap that triggers my step function. In Vistily, uploading a transcript is the trigger, but that still triggers, they call my same step function in my AWS environment. For evals, I used Airtable. I used Airtable interfaces as my annotation tool. And I'm running my evals. I wrote my evals and I execute my evals in a Jupyter notebook. I still, when I run my daily experiments, I'm working out of a Jupyter notebook. When I'm ready to release to production, it gets my code blocks get pushed to AWS Python Lambda functions. Okay, how did you improve the response that you corrected for the students after checking them? Yeah, okay, so this is really this iterative process of like, there's a lot of ways to make improvements. You can try different models. You can change your prompts. You could try temperature settings. You can divide a single prompt into lots of mini prompts. Like there's a million things you can change. And this is where evals are really important because you have to experiment with a lot of things. And like when I started, I didn't even know what temperature was. Like I had to learn this stuff, right? And I'm going to tell you, there's a million courses out there. There's also a lot of free resources. So like I relied heavily on the Anthropic prompt guide. I've been reading a dozen blogs where people are just sharing kind of like this story. Here's what they did. Here's what they tried. Here's what worked. Here's didn't work. I did take a paid course. I took the AI evals course, which I do recommend. It's on Maven. It should be pretty easy to find because it's super popular right now. That course is for engineers. It's a lot of the people in the class are ML engineers. So if you're not code savvy, it might be a little bit hard. I would love to hear from you, like my quick poll I'm going to do really quick. Is there a part of the story that I shared that you would want to know more about? Whether it's evals, whether it's error analysis, whether it's the tooling. Do me a favor and just type in chat right now what you want to learn more about. I'm particularly really interested in evals because it seems the closest to the discovery feedback loop. So I probably will be doing more there. But definitely tell me what you'd love to know more about because I will be doing more events and probably even a course on this stuff eventually. Okay, let me keep going through Q&A. When do you think it's safe to release such an AI coach product? Yeah, I'm constantly in my head about, is this good enough? Does it need to be perfect? It's probably never going to be perfect. We're talking about non-deterministic products and non-deterministic output. My concern is identifying the failures that will derail a student, right? So for me, a lot of those are those general questions, those leading questions. I don't want my coach suggesting a bad behavior. And so I've prioritized my error categories based on the ones that I think are the most catastrophic from a learning standpoint. Those are the ones that I prioritize as I iterate on my prompts, as I iterate on my evals. So you have to prioritize, like these tools are never going to be perfect. But it's just like anything. We have to evaluate when good enough is good enough. Let's see. Your original Python evals were based on finding keywords in the transcript. May have missed. Did you ever expect that testing method to account for words have? Yeah. Okay. So one of my evals is based on words in the, it's not in the transcript. It's in the LLM response. I'm not looking for, did the interviewer ask leading questions? I'm looking for, did the coach suggest a leading question in their coaching tip? And I found in my experimenting, at first I started with the LLM as judge for that eval. And actually, it was hard to explain a general question, like it struggled a little bit with that. And I realized after looking at like over 100 traces, I realized that almost every general question had one of those keywords. Now, is that a rock solid eval? No, it might end up being brittle in practice. I can always experiment with also having an LLM as judge. And because I can score my judges against human output, I can evaluate which judge is going to perform best over time. And I'm still doing a lot of that work. That's a lot of my iterative work that you see that's represented by this bullet point here. Okay, what tools used to generate the transcripts? My students are submitting the transcripts. So that's my user input is a student's real interview transcript. What would it take for you to feel comfortable releasing this as a product at scale? Yeah, okay, so this is a great question. One of the biggest challenges I have for me personally releasing this product at scale is I do not want to go through the data process to do this on real customer data. I don't want to be SOC 2 compliant. I'm a company of one. That is just not it costs tens of thousands of dollars. There's a ton of ongoing data practices. This is why I've partnered with Vistily. They've already done that. They do that work. So I will be offering the interview coach as a product at scale on real interview transcripts, but I'll be doing it through a partnership with Vistily. I suspect what's behind that question is how do I know it's good enough for that? Through our partnership, we are doing a very controlled iterative release. We're starting with a very small number of beta customers that are opting in to letting us see full traces so we can continue to run evals, we can continue to get an error rate, we can continue to see which failure modes are coming up. Only when we're confident that it's good enough feedback that we'll then release it to more customers. We're also requiring that those customers have access to our curriculum content. So they either have to be a student or an alum of our continuous interviewing course. That is because our rubric is very based on what we teach. And for example, a lot of people go, what is setting the scene? The setting the scene feedback doesn't make a lot of sense unless you've gone through our course content. But I will shout out, so a lot of our July beta customers are going through our July cohort. When we do a big launch in September, as part of that launch, I'll give you a sneak peek. We're also going to make some of our interviewing teaching content accessible to more people. So there's going to be a big launch in September that's part of that as well. Okay. Have you found any limitations on the evals already? The biggest thing that's hard about evals is when you do code-based evals and LLM as judge evals, your evals are almost a product in and of itself. So there's a lot of iteration on getting your eval scores to match your human grade scores. There's a lot of iteration there. But when you put that work in and you get high scoring judges, it allows you to have a lot more confidence in the quality of your LLM product. So for me, that work is well worth it. But it does take a lot of iteration. For any LLM eval example, did the LLM define leading questions or did you provide a definition? I provided a definition of leading questions, and that's part of that iteration on that eval. I had to iterate with evals. I want to use the smallest model that is going to be good enough because I want to keep costs down, but I also want to make sure my eval is reliable. And so on that slide where I showed my judge scores with true positives, true negatives, false negatives, false positives, those are my judge scores. That's helping me understand, do my judges match my human graders? In this case, I'm the human grader, and it's helped me understand the quality of the judges, and then the judges are helping me understand the quality of the coach. What did you mean by using evals instead of data sets? Yeah, so data sets are like, I have a huge spreadsheet of inputs and the desired output, and I run the input through the LLM, and I look at, does the output match my desired output? That works really great when your LLM app is like assisting you with like, help me find a movie recommendation or tell me who's in this movie, like where you can define inputs and desired outputs. With interview transcripts, like it's really hard to define. There's a lot of potential good enough outputs. And so like just defining a data set of like good and bad traces, it's really hard to have confidence that that covers everything. Whereas if I do my error analysis on my traces and come up with error categories and I'm writing my code-based evals and my LLM-based evals, my LLM is judge evals based on those error sets, those error failure modes, then I can have a lot more confidence that it's matching what I see in production. What was your process to keep track of the result of your changes in the prompts? That's evals, right? So every change I'm now running, every change that I make, I now run all my evals and I'm getting tables that look like this. So I can evaluate, did this change improve things and I should release it? Or did this change make things worse and I should toss it? Now, maybe what's behind this question, I keep a release log. So in Airtable, I have a table of product releases. I'm keeping track of every change that I make. I'm keeping track of the experiment results for that change. And I'm making a decision about, does it get released to production or does it get rolled back because it didn't improve the overall quality? Okay. How do you version your configuration and results of evals, like the prompt and other config? Okay, yeah, so one of the things I'm doing that's really simple is whenever I run my Jupyter notebook, so I make a change, I run all my evals, I get output, I actually save that version of my notebook with all of the output, and I commit it to Git. So all my experiment results are version controlled through Git. I'm also going to tell you, on that Sunday when I started writing my evals, I had never used Git before. So if you're not an engineer and you've never used some of these tools, I literally went to ChatGPT and I said, I'm starting to work out of a Jupyter notebook. I've never used Git. What do I need to do to version control my notebooks? I then did that for my code. And then I said, okay, I want a version control on my output. So I have a record of my experiments. How should I set it up? Just walk me through it. And ChatGPT walked me through all of it. Okay. Confused by the use of the Jupyter notebook. What did it do for you that Zapier didn't? Okay, so Jupyter notebooks, if you're not familiar with coding notebooks, it's a mix of markdown plus code blocks that you can actually execute. So I'm not just writing my code in the notebook, I'm actually running my code in the notebook. So this block that you're looking at here is the output of me running all my evals, and it shows up in my notebook. And then I can commit that notebook to Git with all that output data so that I have a history of every experiment that I've run with the results. And then that allows me to compare like prompt A versus prompt B. So it's like an A/B test. And this is if people are interested in Jupyter notebooks and how to use them, I could do another session on like how I got started and what I did. Because I'm starting to believe that maybe Jupyter notebooks are how product managers and engineers can work together on this, because I do think the product manager is going to be making all these changes, experimenting with models, experimenting with prompts, but the engineer is probably writing those code blocks. But what we don't want to have happen, like I can now run 20 experiments in an hour, right? Because I can make a prompt change, run my evals, make a temperature change, run my evals, make a chunking strategy change, run my evals. I can do that all day long. I don't want to have to go to an engineer and say, can you run the evals? I can do it right out of my notebook. So it's like I have my own development environment that's not touching production. I can't break anything, but it allows me to execute all my evals and get scores so that I can run all my own experimenting locally. And it's only when I find something that is a good enough improvement that I can push it to production. Okay. How are your students generating transcripts? They are conducting interviews. They are recording their interviews. Right now they have the option to send me the video and I create the transcript using Mac Whisper, or they can just, if they already have a tool that's giving them transcripts, they can just send me the transcript. In Vistily, they are about to release a tool that's going to make this really easy in Vistily, but I cannot share what that is yet. When you talk about how many days something took, was this pretty much the only thing you were doing? And do you mean an 8-hour workday or some other kind of day? Really great question. I do run my own business. I'm a company of one. We have classes running all the time. There's a ton of administrative work. I don't think I ever had the luxury of one full day where this is all that I did. I also, as a human, do not have the capacity to work probably more than 8 hours a day. Like I just get a lot of mental fatigue, especially doing this kind of work. So like full transparency, I started this project in late March. I've probably been working on it 60% of my time during that time period and was able to get this far. Now, remember, I do have some coding background. I'm not totally beginner, but a lot of the coding skills required for this, I had ChatGPT walk me through it. What's the rough cost to process a single interview? This depends entirely on the token length. So in our courses, we do short interviews. We're doing like 8-minute interviews, and then so we get lots of rounds of practice in. Those transcripts are very inexpensive to process. They're costing me like between like 2 cents and like 20 cents. And it kind of depends on how many evals. So I do like eval cascades. I don't run all my evals on every transcript. I have like a set of helpers that look for early signs of things. And then if those fail, it triggers more evals. So I'm like trying to cascade my stuff to keep costs down. For real transcripts, if we're looking at like a 30 to 40-minute interview, those can be 30,000 tokens plus. I have to chunk those. I have to chunk those for the interview coach. I have to chunk them for the evals. This is actually the experiments I'm running right now. I'm getting a lot smarter about which evals need the full transcript, which evals can use just part of the transcript, which small models are good enough. Small models are good at like, is this thing in the transcript? They're not good at the whole, like, that's a little out of scope for this. I'm not going to get into that. But that's a lot of the work I'm doing right now is to support the Vistily integration. As transcripts get longer, this whole interview coach problem gets a lot harder because while LLMs have really big context windows, their performance across a big context window starts to degrade as the context window gets bigger. So I've had to learn a lot about chunking strategies and like how to optimize the right chunking strategy for the right eval. Okay. Can you do a session to show how you're setting up your experiments on the coach? Yeah. Am I endorsing Vistily? I am. I'm officially an advisor for Vistily. I'm a big fan of their team. They really get my work, and they're building a pretty darn good tool to support discovery. So if you are looking for a tool to support opportunity solution trees, processing interviews, KPI trees, they're fantastic. Definitely check them out. Okay, we are way over time. I really want to I want to thank all of you for who stayed. If you haven't already, let me know in the chat where you would want to go deeper on any of these different topics. And I'm actually really interested, like, tell me your role. So like if you are interested in evals, tell me if you're a product manager, if you're an engineer, just because I'm trying to understand, like, do product managers need to learn some of these coding tools? Should we be pairing product managers and engineers to do this work? And especially if you use an LLM app, like if you're building an LLM app and you're figuring out some of these work patterns, let me know what you're doing because I would love, I'm going to be diving deep on this stuff. And especially for me, evals fit that fast feedback loop that is really similar to the other stuff we do in discovery. I'm really trying to learn how do we do this well, and I want to help other people figure out how to do this well. Okay, we went way over. Thank you for those of you who are adding comments to the chat. And stay tuned. I'll definitely be doing more events around this topic.